It's time to abolish the death penalty once and for all. In 1976, the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty after striking it down only years earlier. The court believed that new safeguards could solve the arbitrariness that had led it to stop executions just years before. But for the last 50 years, we've seen how wrong they were. Who gets sentenced to death today hinges more on the race of the victim, race of defendant, where the crime took place, how much money they have, and the skill of their attorneys, not on the severity of the crime. Hi, I'm Alex Valdez. I'm a staff attorney in the ACLU's Capital Punishment Project. Welcome to Making Sense, a show where we answer your questions about the top issues impacting our civil rights and liberties. Today, we're going to be making sense of the modern-day death penalty. Let's dive in with your first question. Where does the death penalty come from, and how long has it been in America? Capital punishment is one of the oldest punishments in human history, dating back to the ancient Babylonians. It came to America through British common law with the colonies. And in America, the death penalty is deeply intertwined with our country's history of racial terror, as it grew in popularity as a legal alternative to lynchings once they became less palatable. The death penalty came closest to ending in 1972 when the Supreme Court struck down existing death penalty laws in Furman versus Georgia because of how arbitrary they were. States then rewrote their laws and tried and fix those problems, and the Supreme Court eventually reinstated the death penalty with its decision in Gregg versus Georgia a few years later. We refer to the time after Gregg as the modern death penalty era, so when you hear about studies of the modern death penalty, that's what we're talking about. This year marks 50 years after Gregg. While the court hoped Gregg would fix the problems with the death penalty, the last 50 years have taught us that the system is unfixable. It is and always will be a broken system filled with racial bias, error, and arbitrariness in who gets sentenced to death. All right, next question. How many states still have the death penalty, and how many people are sentenced to death and executed each year? So, 27 states still use the death penalty, but 4 of those have pressed pause on executions with a moratorium. Now, 23 states and also DC have abolished it. Here's where it gets interesting. In 2025, less than half of all capital juries sentenced someone to death, so there were actually only 23 new death sentences. But at the same time, executions went up. There were 47 executions in 2025 compared to 25 the year before. So what do these two trends mean? It means that the rise in executions and the very loud political voices that support them is not a sign that America wants the death penalty more. The people being executed committed crimes back when people supported the death penalty more, when jurors and lawyers understood less about trauma and mental illness, before social media could educate people about the flaws in the death penalty and the horrors of wrongful convictions and executions. So next question. How do most Americans feel about the death penalty these days? So support is actually at an all-time low. Most Americans under 55 now oppose it. Well over half of 35 to 54-year-olds and 18 to 34-year-olds now oppose the death penalty. Those numbers are even higher among younger generations. The clearest sign of this shift away from the death penalty is in the patterns of capital jurors themselves. Last year, juries rejected the death penalty 56% of the time, meaning that even in death penalty states, with juries often stacked against defendants, most juries still chose life over death. For our next question, does the death penalty actually deter crime, and what do the statistics say? So, no. Easy answer. This is one of the most common myths about the death penalty. The scientific consensus, including from the National Academy of Sciences, is that there is no reliable evidence that death penalty deters homicides. Studies actually show that murder rates rise and fall totally independently of whether the state has executions or not. For the next question, is it true that only people convicted of the worst crimes get the death penalty? So, unfortunately, no. Who actually gets the death penalty is really arbitrary, and it has a lot to do with factors that have nothing to do with the crime themselves. Geography is one of the biggest reasons. There are a small handful of outlier counties that drive most of the country's death sentences. Less than 2% of US counties account for over half of the nation's entire death row. And then some prosecutor offices, like in Riverside County, California, just pursue death far more aggressively than others in the same state. And the quality of legal representation varies heavily based off of how much money each county spends on defense. So committing the exact same crime on one side of a county line versus the other can be a difference between life and death. We'll talk about the ways that racial bias plays a huge role in who gets the death penalty too. And the people we're executing aren't the worst of the worst that the death penalty is supposedly reserved for. In 2025, 83% of people executed had at least one serious vulnerability. 27 had a serious mental illness, 25 had low IQ, brain damage, or intellectual disability, and 28 had significant childhood trauma or abuse. So take Byron Black in Tennessee, for example. He was intellectually disabled, and even the local prosecutor agreed that that should have made him ineligible for execution, but Tennessee executed him anyway. Next up, we have How often do wrongful convictions happen? You know, in the modern death penalty era, at least 202 people have been exonerated from death row in the United States, and at least 21 others who were likely innocent were executed. There's a lot of disturbing examples that I could talk about, but two that stand out for me are in 1998, Florida executed Leo Jones, a black man, for killing a white police officer, even though his conviction was based partly on a false confession that a police officer later bragged that he had gotten by beating Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones was sentenced to death by an all-white, non-unanimous jury, meaning that 3 of the jurors on his trial voted that he should live. And just 2 years ago, Missouri executed Marcellus Williams, a black man, for a 2001 robbery and murder of a white woman, despite DNA evidence excluding Mr. Williams from the murder weapon and testimony from a jailhouse informant who was paid $5,000 to testify against him. Even though a month before his execution, Mr. Williams agreed to a life sentence through a plea that would let him maintain his innocence, Missouri Supreme Court blocked that agreement, and the state killed him anyway. Let's see, someone's asking, what leads to so many wrongful death penalty convictions? Well, the leading cause is official misconduct by police and prosecutors. When a horrific crime happens in a community, law enforcement faces enormous pressure to deliver a conviction, and from patterns and exonerations, we can see that that pressure leads to coerced confessions, hidden evidence, and false testimony. Unreliable eyewitness identification and junk science forensic techniques like bite mark analysis also contribute. And of course, running through all of it is racial bias, which shapes everything from jury selection to which cases even go to trial. Has there always been racial bias in the death penalty? And if so, is it by design? Okay, great question. Yes, absolutely. So the death penalty in America is directly rooted in our history of lynching and racial terror. As lynching became politically unacceptable, public officials actually promised legal executions to appease lynch mobs, and that legacy still really shapes the system today. The single biggest predictor in whether someone is sentenced to death is the race of their victim. People who kill white victims, and especially white women, are far more likely to face the death penalty than people who kill black victims, even if the cases are similar. Black defendants are also more likely to be charged capitally, more likely to be sentenced to death, more likely to be excluded from juries, and more likely to be wrongfully convicted in the first place. Black adults make up just 14% of the country's population, but 41% of people currently on death row, and more than half of the 200 plus people exonerated from death row since 1973 have been black. Racial bias in the death penalty is a pattern that has been studied and proven repeatedly, and who gets sentenced to death still depends more on the race of the victim and the defendant than on how serious the crime was. If you have any other questions about the death penalty, feel free to drop them in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer them in a part 2. And remember to like and subscribe to ACLU's YouTube channel for future episodes of Making Sense.